Hello, this is Russ Walden with Father's Heart Ministry. Welcome to the Morning Light Daily Bible Study. Today we're studying Exodus chapter 4. Moses argues with God. A friend of mine made a statement one time. He said that God is more interested in relationship than he is in respect. And that is not a truth by exclusion, but it is certainly a truth by emphasis. And we see a reflection of this in our chapter. When Moses stands before God in the burning bush, and in spite of the miracles he sees, he's still intimidated, and he objects to God regarding the commission to lead the people out of Egypt. Have you ever felt unqualified? Have you ever argued with God about the call on your life? God remonstrates with Moses and assures him that the assignment he's commissioned to will be accompanied by signs, miracles, and wonders to accomplish the task. And we'll begin by reading the entire chapter, Exodus chapter 4. And Moses answered and said, "Behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken to my voice, for they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, What is that in thine hand? And he said, A rod. And he said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled before it. And the Lord said to Moses, Put forth your hand and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand and caught it, and it became a rod again in his hand, that they might believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, hath appeared unto thee. And the Lord said furthermore unto him, Put now thy hand into thy bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, it was leprous as snow. And he said, Put your hand into your bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and plucked it out of his bosom, and behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe you, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, that they will believe the voice of the latter sign. And it will come to pass, if they will not believe these two signs, neither hearken to your voice, that you will take of the water of the river and pour it on dry land, and the water which you take out of the river shall become blood upon dry land. And Moses said unto the Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since that you have spoken unto your servant, but I am of a slow speech and of a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who has made man's mouth? Who makes the dumb or the deaf or the seeing or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now, therefore go, Moses, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you will say. And Moses argues, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. In other words, send somebody else. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well, so apparently Aaron had the gift of gab. And also, behold, he comes to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. And you will speak to him, and you will put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. And he will be your spokesman to the people, and even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and you shall be to him instead of God. And you will take this rod in your hand, wherewith you shall do signs. And Moses went and returned to Jethro, other places call him Reuel, his father-in-law, and said unto him, Let me go, I pray you, and return to my brethren which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace. And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return to Egypt, for all the men are dead that sought thy life. And Moses took his wife and his sons, and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And the Lord said unto Moses, When you go to return to Egypt, see that you do all of these wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart, and he will not let the people go. And you will say to Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my firstborn, even my firstborn. And I say to you, Let my son go that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your son, Pharaoh, even your firstborn. And it came to pass by the way in the end that the Lord met Moses, and sought to kill him. What's going on? Then Zipporah, Moses' wife, took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, Surely you are a bloody husband to me. So Moses, who understood perfectly well about circumcision, apparently refused to circumcise his own son, and it put Moses outside the covenant in so doing, and the angel of the Lord sought to kill him. Pretty sobering. And so he let him go, verse 26. Then she said, A bloody husband you are because of the circumcision. And the Lord said to Aaron, Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went, and met him in the mount of God, and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him, and all the signs which he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron went together and gathered all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spake all the words of the Lord that he had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. And what happened? The people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their affliction, then they bowed their head and worshipped. What a auspicious beginning. They didn't always receive so well what the Lord had to say and the promises of God, but in this case, when they saw the signs, they bowed their head in worship. So, back to verse 1. In verse 1, Moses is concerned about the people not believing that he is commissioned by God to lead the people out of Egypt's bondage. Moses feels that they're not going to believe that God appeared to him in the burning bush in the desert. Now, what about you? Have you ever experienced or felt the call of God in your life only to be rejected by those that you know God sent you to? That can't be an excuse for not pursuing the thing God has put on your heart. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 10, Peter made the following statement. He said, Give diligence to make your calling and election sure. For if you do these things, you shall never fall. So it's up to us to make our calling and election sure, regardless whether family, friends, the people we're sent to accept it or not. Just because the thing God has called you to is difficult or others are not on board, that does not give us permission to disobey or to give up. Just because people don't accept your experience in God is no basis for throwing up your hands and forgetting about the commission of heaven upon your life. And it's a common experience. God's answer to Moses in this chapter is God's answer to us. What is that in your hand? Well, when you feel the call of God, we tend to look away from ourselves for sufficiency, but God is asking Moses, no, what is that in your hand? For Moses, it was a shepherd's rod, because this is what Moses did for a living. Now, what do you do for a living? What is your life's employment right now? You would be surprised to what extent God uses one's life experience, uses your life experience to equip you for your call. Even if you feel like a total failure or that you have nothing to offer, the greatest tools you can give God to work with are in your hand right now. Now, what did Moses do with the rod that God gave him? Well, he was told to cast it to the ground. What happened? Well, it was a miracle. But the point being, shepherd's rods on the ground aren't any good. Shepherd's rods are not meant to do anything by throwing them on the ground. You have to be willing to cast your rod on the ground. You have to be willing to move beyond convention and common sense. It didn't make sense for God to ask Moses to do that. But in order to see God's power demonstrated, it becomes necessary for you to be willing to obey even when it doesn't seem logical. Now, when the rod turns into something else, what does Moses do? He runs away. Sometimes God will do something in your life and you might want to run away. Have you ever experienced that? I've seen many people give up in fear because things don't work out like they expected them to in regard to their call. Next, God tells Moses, don't run away. He tells him to pick up the very thing that frightened him and made him flee. Listen, never be fearful of going back into an intimidating situation or something that makes you nervous. What do you have to lose? God is God. God will never let you down. Moses picks up the serpent by the tail and it becomes a rod again. Now, the tail of a serpent in Scripture represents false prophecy. You got to pick that thing up. You can see that in Isaiah 9:15. You can start out to obey God, and it doesn't look like things are going to work out. It looks like the word you got from heaven was a false word. No, you got to pick that up. Other people wiser than you may predict that you're going to fail. You may feel like a failure yourself. Pick up the serpent of that false prophecy by the tail, and your rod of authority will be made manifest. See, the authority was not just in the rod. The authority was in the man who took up the rod against everything in him that was saying differently. And then if you do this, then as in Moses' case, what happened? Then the people believed. See, Moses had to believe, and then the people believed. It wasn't getting the people to believe, and then Moses believed. Furthermore, God gives Moses a second sign. He tells Moses to put his hand into his bosom, and it comes out leprous as snow. This is very important. What is God saying? Don't look to yourself. Don't be reaching into your own natural ability. Don't trust in your own ability. How did God solve the problem for Moses? He told him to put his hand back into his bosom. In other words, when you find yourself leaning on your own strength, on your own devices, you have to be willing to reverse yourself. You have to be willing to back up, lay down the arm of flesh, and then everything's going to be okay. Keep your trust in God no matter what. Look to God and not to yourself and not to somebody else. The promise God goes on to give Moses is that if the people don't believe the first sign of the rod turning into a serpent and then back into a rod, they will undoubtedly believe the second sign. How do we apply that to our life? If the people don't believe you when they see you moving against fear and stepping in authority, they will believe the second sign of not relying on your own natural fleshly abilities, but relying on God alone. Now we see in verse 10 that Moses is a very strong personality. In spite of all this, he's still resisting. He still resists with the complaint, oh, I'm not eloquent, I'm slow of speech. God chastises him because it's stubbornness at this point. And he insists to Moses, Moses, I'm going to be your mouth. And God says, I will tell you, Moses, what to say and when to say it. Now, this is the point that Moses is trying the patience of God to the end that what God, if we're paying attention, what God originally had in mind is unalterably changed. Moses continued to maintain that he is not articulate in speech, and God says, okay, I'll send Aaron. Aaron will be God's spokesman for Moses, and Moses will be to Aaron instead of God. This was not God's original plan, and we really do need to learn from this. Things get complicated when you don't trust in God the first time. God's Spirit will not always strive with us, and if we continue to resist, you're going to wind up with something in the plan of God for your life more complicated than the fulfillment of God's plan called for or was necessary at the beginning. Now, after this encounter at the burning bush, what does Moses do next? In verse 18, he returns to his father-in-law, and notice what he does. He asks Jethro to release him to return to Egypt. Now, I've never heard anybody teach on this. Jethro was not a pagan. He was a Kenite, and by tribe, and it is known that the Kenites were worshipers of the Jehovah at that time. Nonetheless, you would think that the burning bush encounter, without question, would negate any commitment Moses felt like he had, but we see Moses coming as a man under authority. He understood order, and he's not just going to leave. His sense of duty requires him, regardless of the burning bush, regardless of the rod turning into a serpent back into a rod, the thing with the leprous hand, he feels he must have Jethro's blessing. Now, Jacob didn't do that. When Jacob served Laban, the time came that he left, but he left in secret, and he created a problem and almost got killed for doing it. Now, what about your situation? If God calls you, who are you going to ask permission? You have to ask yourself, are you a Jacob or are you a Moses? Jacob fled Laban's employ without so much as a by your leave. Every situation is different, and you must seek the face of God and not make assumptions based on your own rationale. But we need to listen to the Lord about stepping out on our own initiative without being under authority and acting under authority. In verse 20, Moses leaves for Egypt with his wife and 2 sons. Now, Moses' sons will make up the ancestors of the tribe of Levi, specifically the Kohathites and the Merarites. And Aaron's family line will establish the high priestly order and lineage. The question of Moses taking his family with him is in contrast to the disciples of Jesus, the original 12. They did not take their families with them when following Jesus or when pursuing the apostolic mandates that came after. They were not known to have their wives and their children with them. But yet there were other apostles that came after that Paul makes reference to that did bring family members with them. So what do we learn from this? It's like when Jesus told them, whenever you go out, take nothing with you. And then another time he says, if you have an extra coat, if you have a sword, if you take that with you. You can't get hard and fast about how God does things. You have to listen to the voice of God. Sometimes God may instruct you that you conduct yourself in one particular manner, but then tell someone else to do exactly the opposite. There's a lesson to be learned here, because people go out and say, well, you have to do things the way God told me to do them. No. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. In the last chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus impressed this upon Peter. Jesus was putting Peter under pressure, making demands upon Peter that made Peter uncomfortable. And all of a sudden, Peter wants to talk about, well, what about John? What's John going to do? In other words, don't be so worried about what somebody else is going to do. You do what God called you to do. Because Jesus went on to say to Peter in John 21:22, he says, hey, if I want John to stay right there, tarry till I come, what is that to you? Follow thou me. So don't worry about the other person. The other person may have latitude that you don't have. God may restrict you in ways that he does not restrict the next person. Or he may deal with you liberally in matters that he holds somebody else to a strict standard. Don't try to emulate what others do. Be persuaded in your own mind and obey God. Now, what are Moses' instructions once he arrives in Egypt? He's to command Pharaoh, verse 22, to let the people go. And if Pharaoh refuses, the warning is that he's supposed to convey is that God will slay Pharaoh's firstborn son. Can you imagine saying that to a world leader in his own court? That would be taking your life in your hands. But nonetheless, this was the command of God. Now, how do you apply that in your situation? What if God tells you to do something that has risk involved? Every one of the apostles except John died a martyr's death. We hear a lot of people claiming to be apostles, but I don't see any of them getting arrested and thrown in jail. I don't see any of them under capital crimes. Is that because we're so much more sophisticated and civilized today? I suggest you watch the evening news, and you'll see that that is not the case. When true apostles come on the scene, they're going to wind up very quickly, out of obedience to God, they'll wind up with a prison record. They'll wind up with lawyers on retainer because they're confronting culture. Don't you call yourself an apostle unless you're willing to put it on the line, to take a risk and confront culture to the point that it just might cost you something very cushy about your life. This is very sobering for us. It challenges us to take our call much more seriously. So he has these instructions, and Moses is on his way. But incredulously, in verse 24, we find that the Lord meets him after all these instructions and seeks to kill him. Why? Because his sons were not circumcised. Think about Samuel. Samuel was a great prophet, but his sons were not circumcised in heart. And because his sons disobeyed and corrupted the priest's office and the prophet's office, people wound up saying, well, forget this, give us a king like other men. They rejected God because of the corruption in Samuel's sons. In this case, here Moses had grown up, yes, in Pharaoh's house, but he was circumcised as a child, and his mother and his sister were a part of the household in Pharaoh's house, and no doubt taught him the ways of the Lord. But Moses apparently didn't think it was important to circumcise his children. And this put Moses outside the covenant of Abraham and almost cost him his life. This is important to us because while Moses was required to be circumcised in his flesh, you and I are required to be circumcised in our heart. You cannot go about to fulfill the call of God with an uncircumcised heart. There's a lot of people out there claiming to be the called of God, claiming to be the apostle of God, but they are not circumcised in heart where their wives or their spouses are concerned. They're not circumcised in heart where their children are concerned. They're not circumcised in heart, and the Lord meets them in the way, and they encounter other conditions and extenuating circumstances they weren't planning for, that they feel threatened because they need to go back and find that place of circumcision of heart. You may find that consequences you're facing as you go about to obey God are more dire than you are prepared for. And of course, you may say, oh, that's old covenant. It doesn't apply today. But Jesus taught that unless our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, we will not enter into the kingdom of God. In other words, we must judge ourselves by a more strict level of demand and integrity even than Moses did, and even than God judged Moses. Or we're kidding ourselves. We must not approach the call of God or the things of God lightheartedly, presumptively, or from the perspective of a narcissistic personality that thinks just because you think something that it's okay. It's not okay. In verse 27, we see that God now sends Aaron into the picture to meet Moses, and Moses relates all of these things to Aaron, and they go together, whistling while they work to the elders of the children of Israel in captivity in Egypt. True to the instructions, and now an altered plan, because Aaron was not originally part of God's plan. Aaron is indeed Moses' spokesman before the people, the only time it actually records Aaron did that. And the people believe and accept that Moses was sent of God, thus setting the stage for the confrontation to come with Pharaoh. God bless you.